The King of the Battlefield. Chapter 11, Boss Battle, End. TL by Yoni. Edited by Yoni and Mayani. T1 lifted his shield of eradication. Clash. However, Releka's strength was beyond his imagination. Hugh. T1, who was holding the shield, just bounced away. Thump. Behind him, Bikes stabbed Releka's side with his dagger. But, it wasn't deep enough. It was like making a light scratch on a tough leather. Gra. After Myung figured out Releka's movement patterns, he started to move. Then Releka instantly turned its body to face him. From the start, Releka knew that Myung was the strongest out of the three. If it could kill Myung, then killing the rest wasn't going to be a problem. It's smart. Indeed, it wasn't an ordinary monster. While holding Anguish, Myung spurred from the ground. In an instant, Myung swiftly jumped for one of its three necks, but Releka's speed was second to none. But, Myung also knew that the Releka was going to dodge. Pug. As he landed on the ground, he lowered himself and extended his foot to trip it. Like tackling, the smooth attack by Myung led Releka to stumble and lose its balance. Afterwards, it turned into a fight of speed. Either Myung was swifter with his sword, or Releka was faster at recovering its balance. By a narrow margin, Myung's sword sliced one of Releka's necks. Grayah. Releka, writhing in agony, quickly backed off. Although it was a critical attack, surprisingly, the wound quickly recovered. All the heads need to be cut off. Even if the head that dropped on the floor wasn't going to recover, he knew that it was going to be hard to land a fatal injury with most of his attacks. I've also suffered. As he slightly tilted his head, he looked towards his right shoulder. The instant Myung went for its neck, one of Releka's claws must have gotten stuck on his shoulder. Blood was gushing out and it was hard for him to use his full strength. If you think about the amount of damage, Myung suffered a loss. Hyung Neem. I will block it. T1 came to the middle and made a wall. T1 probably wanted Myung to stop the bleeding. Myung nodded. This will probably be a long fight. It was unwise to leave a wound unattended during a fight. He rubbed on some herbs that were good for hemostasis, which he had brought. It felt like his skin was burning off, but he gritted his teeth and endured it. Gaya. The enraged Releka started to fight more aggressively. Even if T1 kept trying to block all of its moves, it was impossible. And it has already been a while since Biksu had been knocked out. Myung picked up Anguish again while rotating his shoulder. What Myung felt was excitement. He was aroused by the fact that he could freely express all he had against a powerful prey. Gaia. While ignoring T1, Releka jumped high above the ground and went straight for Myung. It seemed like it knew it was going to die if it didn't kill Myung. And, therefore, made a desperate attempt to kill him. Okay. Bring it on. Myung firmly grabbed hold of Anguish. Son of a bitch. How dare you humiliate me? Juyung moved out of the temple with a group of people. Will this be really alright? It's not too late to return back. Besides Juyung, the 5 people who were with him were all uneasy. It was because they were unsure if the job they were trying to complete while abandoning their post was going to go well. Just shut up and follow me. I'm sure he's probably exhausted by now. Juyung was overflowing with confidence. That bastard said that he was going to kill the boss. It's probably a formidable opponent since he needed to prepare for days. The bastard he was referring to was Myung. Myung was continuously preparing for days for today's battle. The guy who continuously murdered monsters like it was nothing. It meant that the boss they had to kill today was that much stronger. But, it didn't seem like Myung was going to lose. Instead, he had to be exhausted. Juyung was planning on eliminating Myung when he was worn out. I'm going to kill him, take his weapon and the prize he was supposed to earn. If Myung and T1 disappeared at the same time, no one could stop Juyung's advancement. This was the jungle. It was the place where the strongest became the righteous. Oh Zhuyang! Before he came to this place, he was a gangster. After being expelled from high school for violence, he hung around crappy friends and committed crimes. Besides continuously committing violent acts, he stole and threatened others. He was even an agent of an underage prostitution by using juniors from his past high school. He was definitely not a guy who would live by obeying the law. But, Zhuyang was always filled with dissatisfaction. He was dissatisfied that he had to always crawl on the floor in society. And then one day, his life was turned upside down and he was summoned to this blue temple. Getting attacked by monsters, living the true life in the wild where life is considered worthless. He was there. Everything was perfect. He thought that he could finally live how he wanted with no one to stop him. Kim Tae-won? He was a rookie. He was clueless about the bloody underground world. Even if Tae-won had the skills, Zhuyang knew he could get rid of him if he really wanted to. But just one person. Zhuyang couldn't do anything about just one person. Just by his appearance, he seemed to be like a bomb. When he fought against monsters, he didn't seem like a wolf, instead he resembled more closely to a lion. Myung. I just need to kill him. Clash. He heard sounds of an intense fight nearby. Injured Tae-won and Baeksu were both sprawled out on the ground. It was only Myung who was fighting the great monster. But, the fight was about to end. Slash. Myung had sliced off the last head of the monster. Haa. Haa. Myung dropped on the ground and was heavily breathing. From afar, it seemed like he had suffered injuries all over his body. Today's going to be the last day you'll get to act like a mad dog. A smile formed on Zhuyang's face. If he was so exhausted that he had to fall onto the ground like that, even if he was the mighty Myung, he wouldn't stand a chance against 6 men. Releka was strong. It was strange. When he thought of his past memories, he was sure 3 people were going to be more than enough, but instead they could have been the victims. Are my memories wrong? Of course, he couldn't have been able to remember everything perfectly. But, at least they won. He will use these mistakes as a stepping stone in moving forward from today. Who? Myung sat down for a bit after he cut Releka's last head off. There wasn't a place on his body that wasn't sore. There were traces of Releka's claws all over his body. However, he couldn't just continuously rest there. Tae-won and Baeksu, both fainted after receiving injuries. It wasn't good to leave them unattended. Even the Shamba's attacks weren't finished yet. I will be back soon. He had to kill all the Shambas for him to have an opportunity to treat them. Thump. He stood up using anguish for support. Even if anguish absorbed the blood of Releka, whom he had killed, the amount was small. Instead, the wounds he had received from Releka's attacks were much greater. Maybe it was because Myung had lost so much blood, but his face was white as a sheet. When he was too exhausted to move properly. Mr. Be careful! Susie's urgent cry struck Myung's ears. He then looked around. That crazy bitch! Die! The 6 men who were hiding behind a nearby tree came out. It was Zhuyang and his group. Myung sort of figured out why they showed up there. Far behind Zhuyang, there was Susie who seemed to be out of breath from following Zhuyang from the other side. If Susie didn't warn him, he would have been helplessly ambushed. Even if my body was in this state. He didn't think he wouldn't be able to not notice people who weren't even properly hidden. It was the limit to the body he returned to. Oh Zhuyang! Myung didn't think he would be that reckless. Myung thought he had at least some sense in him. Was his thirst for revenge so strong that he lost all reason? Did Zhuyang really think that he could win against him just because he was exhausted? Stab! Myung pierced through the chest of a person who ran up to him first. Then using anguish, Myung absorbed the blood flowing from the person's body. Zhuyang didn't know the effects of anguish. He probably just thought it was a weapon with an extremely sharp edge. If he knew that it allowed him to recover his stamina like that, he wouldn't dare to challenge him like this. Even without anguish, as his skills were far superior than the 6 men, there was probably nothing they could do. One should not be screwing around a lion just because it was injured. Gush! As he pulled out anguish, he looked at Zhu Yung. Stop struggling and just quietly die. You son of a bitch! This was probably the last frantic attempt for Zhu Yung. You first! Muyong positioned himself again. He gained the stamina to move after killing the guy who thoughtlessly approached him. Then, he slowly spoke. I will tear out your tongue which doesn't have a shred of responsibility. Crazy bitch! Zhu Yung wasn't as composed as his words made him out to be as he tightly held his sword upright. The reason why monsters were a threat was because of their fast speeds and their attack power. They were specialized to risk their life in order to kill their opponent. However, Zhu Yung didn't match any of the above criteria. He was just strong in terms of strength, but that was all. Clash! Smack! After their swords had clashed, Muyong quickly turned his shoulders to smack his elbow against Zhu Yung's chin. Kook! Zhu Yung fell on the ground after suffering from a concussion. Muyong shoved his hand inside Zhu Yung's suspended jaws, which was disjointed. Stretch! Unable to resist Muyong's strong grip, his tongue was pulled out. Because of the grotesque scene that just happened, the other 4 were unable to act rashly. Gah! Next, I will slice off your wrist since you don't need it. He wasn't going to kill him right then. Muyong was the best assassin who completed even the hardest training. He knew how to kill a person while allowing them suffer and make them feel extreme fear. It wasn't the most pleasant experience, but since Zhu Yung stuck out his sword against him, he was an enemy, not any more or any less than that. Swish! Ah! Zhu Yung writhed in a desperate agony. His wrist which was holding the sword was cut off. I'm not really the type to enjoy torture. Lastly, I will slice your head off. Giving him a warning before completing the task. Zhu Yung was in complete fear just by that. However, Zhu Yung shook his head as he still desperately wanted to live. He seemed like he was pleading for his life, but Muyong had already given him a warning. It was Zhu Yung who ignored his warning. Now it was time for him to pay for his choices. Slash. Chapter 12, Necromancer, 1. TL by Mayanai. Edited by Mayanai and Yoni. There wasn't even the slightest hesitation. In a blink of an eye, Zhu Yung's head was separated from his body. The scene was like a berated film, its lack of realism left the surrounding men speechless. Clank! Crash! However, they soon realized that this was reality and they all dropped their weapons on the ground. Then they raised their hands and tried to prove their innocence. I was forced by Zhu Yung, that bastard, to participate in this. Same with me. Didn't you know? If you didn't follow Zhu Yung, you had no choice, but to starve. Ha! Muyong laughed as if he found this whole situation ridiculous. Save your lame excuses. Since they have already raised their weapons against him, there was no need for any excuses. In the past, Muyong knew the reason why the Forest of Death was able to survive amidst all that ill will. The Forest of Death never let an enemy go. It was the same for those who had the possibility to later become an enemy. It was one of the few things Muyong agreed with the Forest of Death. It was foolish to leave those who could later become an obstacle alone. Raise your weapons. Muyong's eyes narrowed. The men shivered at that sight. And at the same time, they realized. They should have never meddled with him. Even if it was injured, a lion was a lion. If they continued to stand there idly, they knew they were going to die. As their instincts told them to move, they picked up their dropped weapons. Fuck! The man, who was the first to come up with an excuse, dashed towards Muyong. Swish! Thud! One exchange was enough. To end this quickly was the only mercy Muyeong could show. As an act of mercy, Muyeong swiftly ended their lives. Swish! Swish! As he moved continuously like a stream of water, their heads fell to the ground. Muyeong recovered some of his stamina as anguish absorbed their blood. The wounds received from the fight with Relaka slowly began to close. Although he wasn't fully recovered, he still recovered enough to hunt the rest of the Shambas. Shortly, he sheathed anguish and started to move. Ah! As the one who spectated everything from afar, Suzy was startled when Muyeong appeared in front of her. Suzy has seen quite a few deaths, but this was the first time seeing a human dying at the hands of another human. It was natural for her to fear Muyeong. "Follow me." But Muyeong didn't care. If she learned something from his actions today, she would live, if not, she would die. The underworld wasn't a kind place for a child. As Muyeong took the lead, Suzy lowered her head and followed along. After splitting the skull of the last Shamba, the above words appeared. Solomon's Hall of Fame. In the past, he did have his name on there. He was at the top of the most humans killed rankings. It seemed like this was a ranking of people with the highest level of contribution in a boss raid at the Blue Temple. If I leave my name in Solomon's Hall of Fame, the demons will learn of my name as well. It was a fact found by the one with the most names on Solomon's Hall of Fame, the Adventure King Argo. Although he didn't know the exact relationship between Solomon and the demons, the story of how the ninth seat Paimon went out to search and kill Argo himself was famous. There was even a secret rumor floating around that if one had many achievements in Solomon's Hall of Fame, they would receive something that could harm even the demons. On top of that, it became much easier to get accepted into one of the great guilds or gather more people. Depending on the situation, it might even unlock a secret mission, however. Muyeong declined. He might have become famous more quickly once he revealed his name, but that was not what he wanted. After all, revealing his name had very little to do with receiving secret missions. There was also nothing good that could come from the demons learning about him. Of course, it couldn't be said that it wouldn't help him become a demon commander under Gremory, but the disadvantages outweighed the advantages. "I refuse." He didn't even bother to say his decision out loud. The names of second and third place were both very famous. They had already established their influence and had been rising at a frightening pace. That was especially the case for Alexandro, who had already become the head of the 9 great guilds years ago. Influential monsters. Which meant that for at least 10 years, no one had broken his record and that Muyeong was finally the one to break it. Even though he probably didn't have any past experiences like Muyeong, the difference was less than 2%. Although results weren't everything in the Blue Temple, Alexandro definitely had the right to rank amongst the top 10. His eyelids slightly trembled. There were a few items that he had heard of within the list. Tyrant's Sword, Soul Shield of Avalokite Tesvara and the Boots of Hermes were especially famous. These were items used by masters. The secret medicine of the sage was known as the epitome of alchemy, and the infinity pouch spoke for itself. There was simply nothing to discard. But the item that piqued his interest the most was the Talisman of Azura. Talismans of the 8 Deva Guardians of Buddhism. There were 8 guardians that served under Buddha. Among them, there was one called Azura. Wasn't this one of the items the 5 great clans searched for day and night? Muyeong didn't know for certain, but he remembered reading a secret document that stated if someone collected all 8 of the talismans, Buddha will descend. The descent of Buddha, it might be hard to believe, but there really could be a calamity that significant. I choose the infinity pouch and the talisman of Azura. There was no need to agonize over it. Anguish was enough for him as a weapon, and infinity pouch was a treasure he might not get the chance to obtain again. For someone who was trying to change everything by himself, it was a vital item. Not choosing the secret medicine of the sage, which could raise the limit of a human, was a regretful loss. However, his growth would be determined by the 4 secret classes he would choose. Not long after, a pouch the size of 2 fists and a talisman floated above his hands. Although the infinity pouch had a limit to the size of the item that could fit, it was limitless in terms of the amount it could store. Myung was quite interested in the Talisman of Azura. Name, Talisman of Azura. Rank, A+. Type, one-time reinforcement type. Effect, contains the strength of Azura, one of the 8 Deva guardians of Buddhism. It can strengthen an equipment or a skill. Aha, Myung nodded his head. After reading the explanation, he understood. The 5 great clans had a few exceptionally incredible weapons. They were probably reinforced by the talismans of the 8 Deva guardians of Buddhism. Unexpectedly, it can also reinforce skills. It wasn't that there were no magical items that could reinforce skills. However, there were only a minute number of them. If one did not have heavenly luck, they would not be able to obtain one. On top of that, the Talisman of Azura had no limitations, so possibilities were endless. Damn it, everyone move! How long are you all going to be spaced out for? Someone lend a hand here. People started to carry the corpses. Though they won the battle, the damage was devastating. Myung packed some medicinal herbs and went out to bring back Diwan and Biksu. 17 people. Out of 28 people, 17 were left. But more than half the deaths were caused by Myung. 5 died from the Shamba raid while 6 died by his hands. Everyone knew of this fact, but did not discuss it. It was because a few people saw the 6 people escape from the battle to kill Myung. There were a few that thought the consequences were too harsh, but they valued their lives. It wasn't like the monsters would stop attacking now that they were so few in numbers. To survive, they had to get stronger, and now, more than ever, they sought to unite as a group. The death of Juyung actually resulted in everyone gathering together as a group. People started to follow Diwan as their leader and the exploration was stopped. However, Myung didn't intend to explore any further. Necromancer. The secret class that was able to single-handedly kill thousands of people in the past. After fully preparing to get the class, he headed out towards the forest. Chapter 13, Necromancer, 2. TL by Mayanai. Edited by Mayanai and Yoni. A massive castle. A man was sitting on a throne built by the bloodshed of countless men. The man, who had a scraggly beard and was wearing silver armor, was the leader of the Sun Guild and also the one who placed top 10 amongst humans, Alexandro. Alexandro Quintart. It had been decades since the underworld started to summon humans, but even among them, he was exceptional. He had the most achievements in Solomon's Hall of Fame after the Adventure King Argo and was responsible for solving a few major dilemmas in the underworld by himself. As a man who started from the bottom, he forged a path for himself, and his grandeur was recognized by all the people in the underworld as a leader of one of the 9 great guilds. However, he was currently looking at his status viewer with a solemn expression. Someone broke my record. There was no one near the throne. Growl. If the humongous lion-like beast, Giant Leo, was excluded. Only people who had permission from Alexandro were able to enter the throne room. And Alexandro would not let anyone in unless it was of utmost importance. Basically, he didn't trust anyone. No matter how faithful a man who had taken an oath was, he was ultimately human, therefore he would not trust them. A risk of an assassination attempt, that was his biggest worry. Although he was ranked in the top 10, that didn't mean that he was impervious to powerful curses or skills. As it hadn't been long since he had become the guild leader, the guild wasn't completely united. They were split into a few different factions, and if they saw a chance, they would devour Alexandro. I can use this. He was not sure if he was able to use the novice hero to his advantage. The record he held in the Blue Temple hadn't been broken for over 20 years. But now someone who had broken that record appeared. After advancing rapidly, this was the golden opportunity for the talented individual to gain the attention of many. If he could use this person to earn a bit more time, he believed he could seize control of his guild. No name. The problem was the new record holder did not reveal his name. In approximately 20 days, the newly summoned individuals would be sucked into the gate and arrive in the underworld, but no one will be able to know who the record holder was. Alexandro knit his brows. It was great news that a new hero had appeared, however he couldn't help but feel a little uncomfortable as well. For what reason did he not reveal himself? Was that even possible considering the human psyche? It was normal for people who gathered in the Blue Temple to reveal their names. It was because there was a reward that was only given to people who accomplished the impossible. Humans would try to leave their trace behind after they overcome something. Of course there were people in the underworld who would intentionally hide their names after a particular achievement, but wasn't that place the Blue Temple? It was a place where people were newly summoned. They didn't know anything. Alexandro pondered as he rubbed his chin. Oatsuki Yuka. That bitch probably knows by now. Solomon's Hall of Fame only revealed the top 3 record holders, and if the records were changed, they would be notified on their status viewers. Oatsuki Yuka, who led the ninjas, would have noticed the appearance of a new talent. She would definitely keep track of the movement of this new seedling. The man who placed 3rd had already died, so there was no need to worry about him. If, by any chance, Oatsuki was to secretly snatch the talent, it would make things difficult. However, even for the great Alexandro, it was hard to win an information battle against the ninjas. If he is deliberately trying to hide himself, I guess I'll have to make this welcoming ceremony especially grand. Alexandro decided to change his plans. Someone who concealed his name. That meant that he didn't want to reveal himself. However, if he was to publicly announce this information, no matter how hard he tried, he would be unable to hide himself any longer. There was no way to openly take him away, but if he could tie up Yuki for a while, he would be able to exercise his right of speech to snatch that no-name away. After he organized his thoughts, his shoulders relaxed. The arrival of a new hero, hey! Smirk? Alexandro smirked. No one hoped for that. None of the ones who held any influence in the underworld hoped for it. It was just something they could use when they needed to. Before Myung left the temple, he left traces around the forest. It was so that he could find the way back even if the areas changed. With King's extraordinary sense of smell and Myung's experiences, they were able to explore the forest with ease. After walking for 3 days, he arrived at his destination. It's been a long time since a human has come here. Within the overgrown vegetation, there was a small wooden house. A black-skinned, long-eared man who was in front of the house looked at Myung. Dark elf. Yet. I am a dark elf and you are a human. Did you lose your way in the forest? But you came too deep for that to be the case. Guide. I came looking for you. He didn't get lost. Myung had precisely wandered through the forest to find this dark elf. The dark elf widened his eyes. Me? That's strange. It's normal for the ones who had just arrived at the temple to not know the existence of a guide. I wonder if you have a special skill? Or you just came here using your senses? He looked at Myung for a second before shrugging his shoulders. It was not in his place to care about that. Just like his name, the guide, his role was to simply guide people. This is the best way to save time. Only this dark elf knew the geography of the forest. The former necromancer coincidentally found the cliff, but Myung had no time to wait for coincidences. So his solution was the guide. If it was the guide, he would be able to efficiently and quickly take Myung to that cliff. Well, if you know about me, you should surely know about the rules as well. Are you talking about the 3 wagers? He replied as if it was something insignificant. There were quite a few people in the past who were able to find the guide, who lived in the center of the forest. Usually they would find him accidentally while exploring the forest or getting lost in it. The existence of the guide was quite well known in the underworld. The guide clapped his hands together. Oh, you really do know quite a lot. That's right. If you are able to beat any of the 3 wagers I suggest, I will take you to wherever you wish. Ah, by take you anywhere, I mean within the boundaries of the forest and the temple. That meant if he wanted, it was possible to be guided to the other temples as well. The massive forest was connected to every temple. However, there was no need to travel to another temple. The remaining survivors will meet when they travel through the gate anyways. The real competition would start then. I have no objection. Only, the wagers were always different. He could only adapt to the following circumstances. As Myung gave him a look, the guide said, "It's good that you're so open-minded. Then should we start with hunting? The winner will be whoever catches a dwarf squirrel, that lives throughout forest, first. The time limit will be by midnight. Isn't that too advantageous for you? I will start 6 hours after you," the guide stated with ease. He looked confident as if he could never lose. Hunting was second nature to him. He was one of the few predators that hunted day and night. It was daytime at the moment, but due to the characteristics of dark elves, he would be able to see clearly in the dark. He had to catch the squirrel as fast as he could. I have to use his composed attitude to my advantage. Myung started to move after he nodded his head. Since he said he would start 6 hours later, Myung planned to hunt it down before then. Although it does live throughout the forest, just like its name, it was only around the size of a thumb. Unless one had extraordinary senses and sight, it would be very difficult to hunt them. However, Myung knew what dwarf squirrels like to eat. Dwarf squirrels like to eat dark red fighter ant eggs. It wasn't hard. In the past, he used to catch a lot of them for assassinations. Since these squirrels were small and fast, they were quite useful for information warfare. Myung searched for an anthill and lit a fire. Once the ants were dazed, he swiftly took out their eggs. He then made a simple trap and waited for a dwarf squirrel to come. Now! Thud! After waiting around 2 hours, a cowardly dwarf squirrel slowly approached the eggs. He didn't lose that chance and dropped the grass-woven basket. He had successfully captured the squirrel. He waited for the allotted 6 hours to pass before returning to the guide. When he arrived, the guide opened his eyes widely and trembled. This is invalid. I didn't even get to start. I have the same thoughts as well. My luck was just good. Of course it was like that. Haha, quite the flexible fellow. Then, let's forget about hunting and do a treasure hunt. I placed a few strips of red fabric around this place. If you are able to find 3 of them before the sun rises tomorrow, it will be your win. If you fail, it will be my win. Fine. Then I guess I'll go prepare my dinner. Hoo. This time, the guide was certain Myung was going to fail and felt confident. Luckily it's a wager I know. Myung had sufficient past knowledge about this wager. If I win twice, it said that he would give me a useful treasure. There was a reason why he didn't end it at the first wager. He once assassinated a man who won 2 wagers against the guide. In his history, there was detailed information about the events that unfolded, and once the man won twice, he received the glass of fire. The glass of fire contained a mid-ranked fire spirit which could spit out an unlimited amount of flames. However, what would happen if he won all 3 wagers? As there weren't even rumors about anyone who won 3 times, even Myung was slightly curious. Myung grabbed a magical item and summoned King. King, avoid places with lots of mana and find the dark elf scent that's on the ground. King. Kai-ing. The man who won this wager in the past used a tracking skill to look for the fabric, but Myung had the Shroomhouse Emperor, King. King was especially specialized in finding magical positions and tracking. Its nose was more advanced than a dog's and was able to distinguish even the smallest difference in scents. It was largely due to King that he was able to safely arrive at this place. The problem was the explosive magic traps. If I mishandle them, I will die. The guide hated losing to an extreme. He would rather see Myung die than lose. Unfortunately, King was able to avoid those places and only find the strips of red fabric. Knock knock. After an hour, Muyong knocked on the door of the wooden house. Hey? Are you giving up already? 3 strips. I found them. What? The guide blinked his eyes and stared at Muyong's hand. There were exactly 3 strips of red fabric. Who? Are you going to call this wager invalid as well? That's not it, but I casted stealth magic on the fabrics. It's just surprising to see you found them already. If you want, I can do the next wager as well. Is that true? The guide cheered. His pride wouldn't let him lose like this. When the sun rises tomorrow, let's have you hide and I'll try to find you. Can't you use magic? It should be easy to find me. I vow in the name of Solomon to not use magic during this wager. I will simply use my physical capabilities to search for you. How long do I have to hide? I will admit defeat if I can't find you by sunset. How about it? Good. It was pretty much hide and seek, and Muyong was most confident in this field. It won't be as perfect as what he could accomplish before, but he definitely had the skills to fool one dark elf. As soon as the day passed, Muyong stepped out into the forest. After climbing a suitable tree, he closed his eyes and slowed his heartbeat. Become one with nature. There were different stages of stealth. If one practiced to an extreme like Muyong, they were able to become one with nature at will. However, without a practiced body, it was uncertain if he could hide from the dark elf for a long time. 50-50. He was gambling everything on that 50-50 chance, and he even constricted the movements of his organs. He even controlled the unconscious movements any living creature would make. In the past he could move in this state, but currently if he was to make even the slightest movement, he would be caught by the guide. He was motionless like a grass swaying from the wind. A few hours have passed. And, dinner time arrived. Thud. As soon as the agreed time had passed, Muyong dropped from the tree. Thereafter, he went inside the guide's house and started to eat the prepared food when the guide opened the door. Why are you here? Gulp. After swallowing the meat he stabbed with a fork, he answered, they say it's easy to miss what is in front of you. He acted like he left the central area, but in fact, he didn't even leave the center. From the beginning, hiding was the field Muyong was most confident in. The guide never thought he would lose due to the special traits of dark elves, but as soon as he chose this wager, his loss was determined. Unaware of this fact, the guide searched the area where he expected Muyong to hide. As he realized this, his legs wobbled. I lost. Only then did he acknowledge complete defeat. Chapter 14, Necromancer, 3. TL by Mayanai. Edited by Mayanai and Yoni. The guide regained his composure after looking like he saw the collapse of the world for a while. Soon after, he looked through his clothes, took out a small magical item with his one hand and offered it to Muyong. Accept it. Since you beat me 3 times, you have the right to receive this. Muyong examined the magical item. As soon as he accepted it, information popped up. Name, Long Distance Teleportation Magical Item. Rank, B+. Type, 1 person, single use. Effect, within the underworld, you are able to teleport to a place you remember. Muyong tried to keep himself as calm as possible. He calmed his spirit and regained his composure. Although it couldn't endlessly emit flames like the glass of fire, to Muyong, the glass of fire was incomparable to this item. To a place I remember. He couldn't return to Earth, but depending on how he used it, it could be incredibly useful. It was peculiar that it didn't have a limit to the distance. If Muyong was a beginner, he might not have had much use for this item. However, as the current Muyong possessed his past memories, he could make use of it better than anyone. He could teleport to a currently undiscovered place with the Star of David and monopolize the rewards, or he gain a secret class much more easily. However, the first thing that came to mind when he first laid eyes on the magical item wasn't either of those. Headley Cow 1. Humans have been summoned into the underworld for a long time, but there were more unexplored areas than there were explored. 5 years from now, due to the foretelling of the Great Calamity, every guild and clan started to organize a wide-scale exploration of the underworld. During that time, they happened upon Headley Cow. Headley Cow was the name of a certain fairy. Although fairies normally have the appearance of a four-legged rock, they were able to shapeshift. On top of that, they were able to possess the same abilities as the target they shapeshifted into. And one of those targets was the phoenix. Once they felt that their life was threatened, they would break out of the rock as a phoenix. However, Headley Cow was too cowardly and fled as soon as it transformed. If he could only capture it, it could have become a material necessary to create an S-rank weapon. Even if he was to absorb it, he anticipated an incredible growth to his abilities, as the heart of a phoenix was an endless supply of magical power. Although the phoenix was a bit weaker than a dragon, its heart was comparable to that of a dragon's. If it was a regular phoenix, it would be impossible to catch, but a Headley Cow transformed phoenix could even be captured by Muyong. It was better than most rewards he could receive from a place with the Star of David. What was worse was that the trials were designed to be impossible to complete by one person. The only obstacle in capturing Headley Cow was that area which Headley Cow inhabited was quite deep in the territory of a demon, so, to secretly traverse the territory, he needed to get stronger. "Is this all?" asked Muyong as cool-headed as he could. It was because it was him, that he had a use for the item. To any ordinary beginner, the item would have been an insignificant reward. At the same time, the guide's expression stiffened. "What do you mean, is this all? It could be a life-saving item, you know. Every time I win, don't I get a reward?" On the first bet, he won the guide's guidance. On the second, he won the long-distance magical item, and now Muyong looked like he was waiting to see what he would get for his third win. "You are very greedy. You are the one that said you would give a reward for a win." "Ugh. Fine. For the last reward, why don't you tell me what you want? I will do my best to fulfill your request as long as it's something I can do." The biggest compromise. It was obvious he was going to coldly refuse the difficult requests. Also, Muyong didn't have anything special to ask of him. "Guarantee my safety for 10 days. Muyong was certain that the guide wouldn't refuse, as this request overlapped with the initial request of guiding him. 10 days? Too long. I won't go over 3 days. Then let's settle for 3 days. Muyong nodded his head. Truthfully, 1 or 2 days would have been sufficient. Since he knew the guide was going to haggle, he purposely asked for 10 days. 3 days was a splendid result. The guide was stupefied when Muyong agreed so easily. However, Muyong knew what kind of existence the guide really was. The past aide of Solomon, a magician who can only live in the Blue Temple. A supreme magician more than 1,000 years old. He was a guide and at the same time, a protector. With his existence, the Blue Temple was completely protected. Even the great demons were not able to easily break into the Blue Temple. However, he was unable to leave the Blue Temple. In a certain way, he was the Blue Temple. It was because he had aged to a point where he should have been long dead. However, he heard that the guide periodically reversed the effect of time on his physical body. It was magic that was only permitted in the Blue Temple. This was why he currently had a naive appearance. As both his physical body and mind would always revert back in time, his physical body had to die to truly awaken the power of the supreme magician. This was uncovered through the demons. A full-scale invasion started after the Great Calamity, where all the humans on Earth were summoned to the underworld. And then, because of the massive gathering of humans, the barrier of the Blue Temple collapsed. 3 of the highest-ranking demons launched an attack on the Blue Temple, and the guide's physical body turned to ashes in an instant. However, afterwards the supreme magician began to reanimate himself. The battle went on for 10 long days, but the supreme magician ended up losing. However, he was an incredible existence who was able to fight evenly against 3 high-ranking demons for 10 days. Although he was not the supreme magician, the current body of the guide was more than enough to ensure his safety within the forest. Since, no matter what his current condition was, his strength was in magic. So where are you planning on going? I will first fulfill my role as a guide. Shing. Muiyong unsheathed anguish. And then, he ran towards the forest. That crazy. After staring at Muiyong's fleeting image and hearing the shrieks of various monsters, the guide finally realized Muiyong's intentions. So that's what he meant by ensure his safety. That was it. The reason why Muiyong asked him to ensure his safety for 3 days. Shut up and hunt. He planned to wipe out the monsters without looking back. Muiyong ran like crazy. As if to show what it meant to run like crazy, he didn't even stop to rest for a second. If anything, he jumped towards danger and fought with his life on the line. He knew that the best way to increase his stats was to fight against monsters. At the same time, the one who felt like dying was the guide. Grr. You asked me to only ensure your life, what kind of impractical request is this? The guide only acted when Muiyong was about to die. However, that was not easy to time. With the way Muiyong fought, it wouldn't be weird if he dropped dead at any time. After he had protected him with magic, he was thanked with replies like, I almost lost my flesh and could have ended up as a pile of bones, I got scratched a little, but it's not to the point I'll die. Crazy bastard. So he couldn't afford to look away for a second. The observing guide was much more exhausted. After killing a dark bear, Muiyong said, I need to fight a bit riskier. What? When I avoid every attack by the width of a finger, my agility isn't increasing as fast as I hoped. I need to reduce the width to half a finger. Is that a distance you can reduce just because you want to? It seems to be possible the more I try. The guide was speechless. It seemed like he was looking at a person who couldn't wait to die. If he was able to choose the distance he avoided incoming attack at will, he could already be considered an expert. No, it was difficult even for an expert. However, there was no end to Muiyong's mysteriousness. His technique was definitely above an expert, but it felt like his body couldn't follow through properly. If he was to force himself to move a certain way, it would cause an untimely death. However, the more he fought, the faster his body adapted to his movements. What a crazy, but peculiar fellow. A promise was a promise. The guide had to take care of Muiyong throughout the duration for the determined 3 days. And Muiyong was definitely planning on maximizing the guide's help and fought with every monster he encountered. After doing this for a day and a half, a message appeared. There was even a ranking for this? But, Muiyong shook his head. He didn't have the slightest intent to reveal himself. 3rd place. Muiyong had killed more than 1,200 monsters since his arrival. It was most likely that only monsters that were suitable opponents were counted. Shortly after, hunting record, 3, was added to his history and a hunting map was given as a reward. The hunting map showed which monster's territory he was currently in. It wasn't a very useful item, but it would save Muiyong some time. Muiyong decided not to waste even a second of the remaining time and continued to hunt. Then his ranking slowly started to climb. Finally, he was even able to take 1st place. Herculean strength leather armor was given as a reward. He didn't expect much since he didn't receive any reward for taking 2nd place, but it was a pleasant surprise to receive a B and ranked armor with an effect that increased the wearer's strength by 3. Although he was able to find some equipment in the forest other than those rewards, unfortunately none were useful for Muiyong. Muiyong looked at his status viewer. The status screen popped up. Achievement effect Augremeris Anguish, A, +3 to all abilities. Class effect on none. Strength 41, 30 + 11, Agility 35, 32 + 3. Stamina 33, 30 + 3, Intelligence 17, 14 + 3. Wisdom 16, 13 plus 3, Fighting Aura 19, 16 plus 3. Special note, Fighting Aura has been awakened. Even considering that the Herculean strength leather armor increased his strength by 3, he could see that his base stats had increased considerably. Agility especially increased a lot. His senses had become sharper. Although everyone's stats increased rapidly in the beginning, there wasn't anyone who could compete with Muyoung at this point in time. Not bad. While he was feeling content with his improvement, the guide said, "The promised 3 days have passed. Isn't it time to tell me where you want to go?" Muyoung answered right away, "To the Cliff of Agony." Finally, all the preparations were complete. One Headley Cow is a mischievous shape-shifting creature in a fairy tale. Chapter 15, Necromancer, End. TL by Mayanai. Edited by Mayanai and Yoni. Giant bird-like monsters flew around the steep cliff. There were a countless number of monsters, including one known as the small pterodactyl, the sword-beaked bird, and another whose body was half-transparent, transparent bat. The only thing these monsters had in common was their fierce appetite towards prey. You had to prepare to lay down your life if you wanted to climb this cliff. Are you seriously thinking about climbing this cliff? The guide spoke slowly with a pale face. Even while coming here, Muyoung ceaselessly hunted. To show someone the way, meant that someone had to be alive. Muyoung maximized that subtle reasoning and traveled as slowly as he could. Even if the guide understood his intentions and traveled in places where there were no monsters, Muyoung would always find a way to draw monsters to him. Like they say, he got his money's worth. And thanks to that, the one to suffer was the guide. They only arrived 2 days later than they expected, but the guide's appearance made it look like he aged a few years. "I'm going to climb it," Muyoung replied as if it wasn't a big deal. Unlike the guide, he used anguish to continuously stack up stamina so he wasn't as tired as he thought he would be. The guide's face stiffened and he opened his mouth. "Within the boundaries of the temple and the forest, this is one of the most dangerous places here. Since we're here, I can take you all the way up, but no thanks." It was like the guide was offering him a last bit of service, but Muyoung flatly refused. The Cliff of Agony. At the top, there lied the secret class, Necromancer. And one of the few conditions to receive the Necromancer class was to climb the cliff by himself. If he was to accept the guide's help, all of his efforts would become meaningless. "You really have a thoroughly adventurous spirit." The guide shook his head side to side. Although he had this thought numerous times while coming here, the human in front of him was definitely not normal. He really couldn't tell what he was thinking. It felt like he was recklessly running towards his goal, but since he acted as though he had 12 lives, he felt that it was slightly contradictory. People who have clear goals value their lives. To achieve their goals, they would not hesitate to use any method necessary, but they would at least value their lives. However, when looking at Muyoung's actions, it felt like he was moving on the premise he was going to die. Does he not care about his life? While coming here, Muyoung faced situations where, if it wasn't for the guide, he would have died at least 50 times. If he was to make the slightest error, he would have lost his life. Although he had promised to keep him alive, it was still reckless. What was more, the Cliff of Agony was known as one of the most dangerous places even in the forest. Logically speaking, it was hard to resolve this matter with Muyoung's current level. But he still wanted to attempt it. And without any help. He was thoroughly insane. Because of this, the guide was excited. How far could this insane human go? It felt like it had been a long time since he felt this way. Although his memories weren't complete, he felt that it had been a few decades since he felt this kind of feeling. If only he comes back alive. The guide imagined an impossible scenario. The Blue Temple was a place where people who attempt the impossible will be aptly rewarded. If by any chance, Muyoung returned after climbing the cliff, the guide had no choice, but to admit that Muyoung wasn't crazy, he was just different. That's right. Different. Those that tread a completely different path than others were known as heroes. Although there were many people who claimed they were heroes, in the guide's eyes, they all were incompetent. However, the human right in front of his eyes seemed to be out of the ordinary. If you can pass the cliff's trial, I'll tell you my name. A small swirl of emotion appeared in the guide's eyes. And Weong stared at his eyes as if he was being pulled in. Now that you mention it, the guide, the supreme magician were simply titles, there was no one who knew his real name. It didn't seem like even the demons knew his name. How strange. Up until now, he never really thought about it. He wasn't even curious. The fact that he was able to fight against the demons for 10 days was important, his name wasn't really that important. Of course, the question was, will there be some change by knowing his name? Do I really have to know? There won't be any disadvantages from knowing it. The guide's expression was extremely serious. Weong shrugged his shoulder and turned around. Do what you want. There was no reason for him to refuse if he insisted on telling him. However, it was more important to climb the cliff. Hush! The fierce whines attacked Weong. Like a swaying twig, he perilously climbed the cliff. The only thing confirmed by reading his history was that he had climbed this cliff. The status viewer he read after killing the necromancer was not very detailed. The facts that the necromancer class was attained by climbing the cliff and killing the 5 gatekeepers were all that he knew. Of course, there was no way for Weong to know the methods the previous necromancer had used. That was why he increased his stats as high as he could. To prepare for any situation. Kaiwa. A sword-beaked bird targeted Weong's back with its sharp beak. Weong immediately used anguish to cut its beak in half. The increased agility enhanced Weong's senses. Taking care of a bird that would make a sound while rushing at its prey was simple. Kaiwa. Kaiv. However, as one died, as if they were getting revenge on their fallen comrade, 10 sword-beaked birds rushed at him. From the beginning, I never intended to dodge. There was nothing more barbaric, but the method Weong chose was a direct face-off. He planned to crush all the obstacles and attempt to climb the cliff directly. He took a deep breath, pulled his body close to the cliff and wielded anguish. How far did he climb? The clouds touched the top of his head. Almost there. His whole body was a mess. If he didn't receive the leather armor from breaking the hunting record, he would have had a few fatal injuries. The giant centipedes that jumped out from between the boulders were especially dangerous. He was nearly crushed to death by a centipede wrapping around his body. Others would have sworn that he was completely insane and that he had lost his mind, but to Weong, these situations weren't particularly weird. As climbing an endless cliff was part of the Forest of Death's training regime. If you don't climb, you die. Even if they climbed, they would die from starvation or would fall to their deaths. Half his fellow recruits died from simply climbing a cliff. A red orc. He quickly ended his thoughts, as he climbed onto the top of the cliff and looked around. There was a single cave in the center of the summit. And at the entrance of the cave, there was a red-skinned orc standing guard. It seemed to be one of the 5 gatekeepers, nevertheless it didn't seem ordinary. The fighting aura emitted from his body. His tempered muscles and physique made it seem like it was born to fight. Kurag? The red orc stared at Weong. Come at me. Kadakadak. Weong motioned with his finger. Kururug. The red orc grabbed his big axe and rushed towards Weong. His shoulder got dislocated. The orc's raw strength was greater than what he had imagined. If it had become a battle of strength, there was no way for him to win. He seized his victory wholly through his exquisite skills. Stab. As he stabbed the center of the orc's carcass, anguish started to absorb the blood. He was able to regain a bit of his empty stamina back, but this method was only temporary. Nevertheless, Weong immediately started moving. Kagajek. The next opponent he faced was a Knoll thief. True to his name, he was incredibly fast. He aimed for Weong's neck with his poisoned dagger. Unfortunately, the pairing was bad. Muyong was an assassin second to none. He was able to predict all of the Knoll thief's movements. The fight concluded in 5 minutes. This is driving me crazy. The victor was obviously Muyong. However, he groaned after killing the Knoll thief. His leg was poisoned. He definitely should have evaded it, but the dagger lengthened and cut his leg. It was completely his fault. However, each gatekeeper he fought left a wound. It was as if it was predetermined. It was like for every gatekeeper, the challenger had to be inflicted with a wound. Muyong did not stop. To expel the remaining poison, it would take 5 more days, but he didn't not have the time. As a result, his actions would become rougher the more wounds he had received. Like the uncontrollable Norse warriors, he went berserk. In the end, he able to hunt down the last gatekeeper. Huff! Huff! He panted heavily while gazing at the chunks of what used to be a giant serpent. I think I'm going to die. His complexion was deathly pale. He couldn't put any strength in his fingers. The fight was intense to that extent. He narrowly came out victorious in the life-or-death struggle. Muyong slumped to the ground. It seemed he really had pushed himself too hard. There may have been a better way to do this. As there was only one gatekeeper per fight and there was no time limit. Perhaps if he took his time, he would have been able to win more easily. The previous person to get the necromancer class must have spent days figuring out ways to defeat the 5 gatekeepers. However, Muyong foolishly forced his way through. He crushed everything with a frontal assault. It was truly an intense surprise attack. Overcoming danger makes me stronger. He only knew how to get stronger by pushing himself to his limits. Even if someone kindly taught him a different method, the current Muyong would still tread this path. To push himself like this was definitely dangerous, but he strongly believed if he was to endure it, he would take a step towards his growth. I endured this time and will continue enduring. Muyong gritted his teeth. He will not die. Live the way you want and achieve your goals. Before long, his vision became hazy. Chapter 16, Art of Death, 1. TL by Yoni. Edited by Yoni and Mayanai. A stretch of flat, barren land. Against an army of 1,000,000 undead, more than 1,000,000 humans fought. Most of the humans used swords and spears, while a few users of holy energy and magic were mixed in the crowd. However, there was a great variety of undead. No, there were so many of them that looked so bizarre, it was difficult to define them as undead. Zombies with wings of an angel, skeletons with Pegasus's horn pierced through both of their hands, vampires with the body of a bear, and 3 frog-headed Cerberus. They weren't simply different in appearance, but they were far stronger than a typical undead. They even had an amazing ability to think for themselves and had cognitive capabilities. The general belief that undeads were just dead bodies who moved simply was destroyed. Humans struggled to protect their base, but it was useless. In an instant, there was a mountain of corpses. Massacre, there was no other way to describe this scene. And in the middle of all this, there was a huge lich with a red cape fluttering in the wind. The Death Lord. As the Death Lord raised his hand, thousands of corpses were lifted off the ground and completely reconstructed into the form of a giant. Death is a beautiful thing. Gwa! The giant roared out loud. As the Death Lord gazed at the huge giant, so large that it seemed as if it could touch the sky, he nodded his head. Doesn't it look amazing for something made out of mere humans? As the Death Lord walked, all the corpses he passed by came back to life. The comrades who used to fight with them in battle were now ripping apart and chewing on their hearts and swinging weapons in an attempt to cut their throats off. It was an unbearably horrific scene. Against the overwhelming power, humans were only helpless. Since I'm the king of death, worship death. The ruler of all deaths. He was the Death Lord. The body was burning with a fever. After Muyong had collapsed, he was continuously in a hypnagogic state for the entire day before he could finally get up from his spot. What was that dream? While he was passed out, Myung had a dream that could have been part of a movie. He felt like he had seen a war movie through a big screen. However, it felt strangely vivid. A dream, but not just a dream. Thump! He tripped over his own legs and fell back on the ground. Myung lightly clicked his tongue. It seemed like he needed to first take care of his body before he could even think about the dream. I wasn't able to completely remove all the poison. He remembered using herbs right before he fainted, but it seemed like they didn't completely heal him. Myung gazed at his ring on his finger. Paranormal. The first reward he received in the Blue Temple by killing monsters. Even if it was limited to 5 uses, it allowed for an effect to increase all his stats by 2 for 10 minutes, cast a healing wave, or a fire bolt. I used it twice already. But, I'm not sure if 3 healing waves will be enough for my body to recovery. He used it twice to fight against the giant serpent. Swaa. He chose the healing wave skill among the effects offered by paranormal. Right away, a green light emitted from the ring. The light wrapped around him and rejuvenated his body. After casting it 2 more times, he was back to his lively self. His body seemed to have recovered and gained resistance to the poison. It's done. Since it wasn't a powerful poison, it seemed like the tiny bit left in his body would naturally recover on its own. Swoosh! However, since he had used paranormal to the full, the ring shattered into dust. He felt as if he had wasted it, but considering the situation, it was the best choice he could make, so he didn't have any regrets. By the way, I clearly remember that messages popped up before passing out. He remembered seeing a few words floating in front of him. But he could not remember what it was about. After Myung sipped some water using his water-producing magical item, he looked at his watch to see what had changed. First, he looked at his abilities. Achievement Effect Grimoire's Anguish, A, +3 to all abilities. Class Effect Death Lord, Lord Class, Ruler of Death. Abilities. Strength 44, 33 plus 11, Agility 37, 34 plus 3. Stamina 35, 32 plus 3, Intelligence 17, 14 plus 3. Wisdom 16, 13 plus 3, Fighting Aura 19, 16 plus 3. Special note, Fighting Aura has been awakened. The armor you are currently wearing or using, Anguish, Strength plus 5, and Herculean Strength Leather Armor, Strength plus 3. Nothing greatly changed about his abilities. His strength was definitely the highest, but since his pure stat was only 33 with an added stat of 11, it just seemed very high. However, something he had never seen before was written under class effect. Death Lord. The ruler of death. But, it was the first time he heard of this. There was also something unfamiliar. Lord class. Not even a secret class, but a Lord class? There was no one with a Lord class, at least from the people he had killed in the past. Even Myung, who knew quite a lot of classified information, was totally clueless. Wasn't this the place where he could receive the secret class, Necromancer? Myung instantly shrugged his head. This was the place. The trials were also the ones he had to complete as well. Then, he could only believe the cause was the amount of time he spent on clearing the trials. It clearly stated Masters of Darkness were examining me. I don't have a clue what all this means. Masters of Darkness and Lord Class, they were all things unfamiliar to Myung. For a moment, Myung furrowed his brow. The reason he wanted to earn the Necromancer class was because it was a class that specialized against a large group of opponents. However, if the Death Lord's class specialized against only a few opponents, then he couldn't say he had achieved his goal. He needed to carefully examine the classes he was planning to earn in the future. Skills? Myung turned the pentagram of his watch to look at his skills. There was an addition to his skills besides the skill of the Demon Commander of the 27th Legion. Skill title, Art of Death, F. Description: reinvent and reconstruct death into art. Once the undead is created, it will be graded. Its abilities will be determined by this grade. Death is a beautiful thing. Number Death Lord 1. Even if he had only gained a single skill, he felt like he understood what it could do. This wasn't simply a dream. The transfigured undead in his dreams. It was probably the skill to make those kinds of creatures. Death Lord led an army of 1,000,000 transfigured undead to massacre humans. If it was that powerful, then it seemed enough to fight off the troops of demons, the legion of demon commanders. First, it was a type of necromancer class. His initial worries disappeared. It also seemed like a higher class than the normal necromancer. If he just polished this skill, he believed he could reenact the scene he had seen in his dreams. Also, as he increased his rank, more skills would be added. Myung approached the dead giant serpent. Out of the 5 gatekeepers, it was the monster that tormented him the most. Didn't he almost die from it? He felt it would be beneficial to make it as an undead. Art of Death. When you didn't know how to use a skill, if you just say its name, it usually worked. Soon after, a dark aura emitted from the tips of Myung's fingers and it wrapped around the giant serpent. Swish! The giant serpent started to move slowly. If it's an art score of 0, then does it reduce the strength of the undead? At first, nothing really seemed different. The sluggish movement and basic patterns. However, with a glance, he noticed that it was definitely weaker than before. It just seemed like a great big undead giant serpent. That was all he could say. It was nothing compared to the undeads in his dream, who moved on their own without an order, could think for themselves and overwhelm the humans. Stumble. Myung was barely able to stay up by leaning onto the giant serpent. Maybe it was because he used a skill, he felt as if he was becoming exhausted at an alarming rate. Somehow it seems as though I spent my stamina. It must have been a skill where he couldn't abuse it constantly. From the state he was in, it looked like he could use this skill at most 3 times a day. It seemed like he needed to use it wisely. To increase the art score, different types of materials were generally required. If he used the corpse of the boss that attacked every 10 days, he thought he might be able to get a better score. Let's go down. After thoroughly examining the Death Lord class, he started his way back. He passed out for quite a long time. There wasn't any time to waste. Even if the giant serpent had lost 50% of its abilities, it was quite useful. Its thick hide was a fine shield for Myung, as he climbed down the cliff. Thanks to the serpent, Myung was able to climb down safely. The guide was waiting for Myung at the bottom of the cliff. He looked at Myung in admiration. Hug. Hug. Didn't think you would really make it. Although he did not have any ill will, these words could have caused a misunderstanding depending on who heard them. Myung shrugged his shoulders and spoke. Did you want me to die? No, but it's hard for me to believe that this is real. And from your aura, you don't seem like an ordinary man. It seemed as though you have earned an incredible reward. Myung nodded. The guide was the other self of the Supreme Magician. Although Myung didn't deliberately try to hide the change, it wouldn't have been weird for the guide to notice his changes. What perfect timing! Myung asked one of the questions he had about the Death Lord class. Who are the Masters of Darkness? As if it was trivial matter, he answered. They are the ones who couldn't become gods and by Solomon's laws, became the ones who managed the darkness. But, how do you know? No, did you? They said one of the Masters of Darkness has chosen me. The guide's eyes widened. 1TL note, Blue Temple has Twitter? Chapter 17, Art of Death, 2. The rule administrators have chosen you. It was hard for him to believe. As if that wasn't possible. The guide asked again. Myung nodded his head and started to speak. Is it really that strange? He was honestly just curious. That was why Myung asked so bluntly. The guide was someone who was wholly dedicated to this place, even before the collapse of humans. He might even be the one person who knew more than Muyeong. If the guide didn't have the answers, there was no way for Muyeong to find out as well. His expression was serious. I'm not sure of the details. How many manage the laws of the darkness, who are part of it, and etc. Just know one thing, that they have really high standards. Even if someone completed the impossible, it was rare for them to choose anyone. Then he looked Muyeong again and rubbed his chin. It seemed like even the guide did not have the information about the Death Lord or the Lord class that Muyeong really wanted to know about. The guide continued to speak. But, you were chosen, right? Like a kid who had just found a new toy, his eyes started to sparkle. Great excitement. At the same time, a slight smile appeared on his face. As expected, you truly aren't an ordinary human being. That's probably why you were able to win the 3 wagers against me. While he seemed to be particularly obsessed with wagers, Muyeong could not refute his words. Before Muyeong realized, the guide was holding an orc staff. Even the mood seemed to have changed. The aura of magic surrounding them was so dense that it suffocated Muyeong. Muyeong bent his eyebrows. As Muyeong slowly moved his hand towards his weapon, the guide started to talk again. I'm sorry. I was extremely thrilled. That's right, I probably said that I was going to tell you my name if you came back alive. If it is you, you deserve to know my name. Tisk. Muyeong clicked his tongue as he removed his hand from the sheath and returned his hand to where it was before. Do as you please. To be honest, it wasn't like Muyeong was really curious about his name. What could happen by knowing letters of a name? Seeing how the guide was obsessed about it, Muyeong just thought he really wanted to introduce himself. I'm a druid. Druids were known to be the ones who dealt with nature and spirits. Swish! Out of the blue, the wind blew. The spirits of the wind started to come and surround the guide. Muyeong swallowed his saliva. I thought you were a magician. At the same time, I'm also the supreme magician. You weren't wrong. Even though I was born from an incubus of darkness, I was baptized right away so that I wouldn't be infected by evil. Instead, I was able to gain an enormous amount of power. Of course, there is no way I can display my true powers in this fake form. As if he was boasting, he continued to talk. The system of skills that humans are able to use were made by me. So that as long as you knew the spell, it wasn't hard to cast the spell or to exert magic. Even though the guide said that he was going to share his name, he was bragging about his identity. But, Muyeong didn't really care about his identity. Are you asking me to play 20 questions? The guide looked a bit disappointed. You still don't know who I am. As if his identity should have been obvious by now, the guide clearly found it shocking. I still don't know. Merlin. Merlin. Muyeong looked at the guide. The guide didn't seem like he was joking around. Finally, there was a smile on the guide's face. I'm the Merlin whom you're thinking of. Finally, few words appeared in front of Muyeong. For a moment, a blue light wrapped around Muyeong's body. Just by knowing the guide's name, his magical abilities rose. That meant that the name had that much worth, but it was the first time something like this happened for Muyeong, so it was natural for him to be a bit confused. As expected, you really are talented. Just because someone hears my name doesn't mean that they all get something. A drawing might be just a scribble for someone, but to another, it might be a work of art. Without a care in the world, Merlin became more enthusiastic about Muyeong. It's my first time hearing that Merlin followed Solomon. It wouldn't be correct to say that I followed him. We had no choice, but to combine our strength. If the seal of Le Megeton was to be broken, the fake will become real and the real will become fake. It was very obvious that in a state where everything became chaotic, humans would be annihilated. He also seemed to be the reason to why humans from Earth were being summoned here. Muyeong could not take it as a joke any longer. Right now, Merlin was telling him about the history of this world. He knew that the 72 demons were going to be freed when the seal of Lemegeten was broken. But, even Weong was unaware of the specifics regarding its background. Do you mean the summoning of the humans into this underworld was already decided upon long ago? Merlin nodded his head. Yes. And to be honest, it wasn't too promising either. The demons were too strong and therefore, even if they were to prepare for them, there was always a limit. That's why, our only hope was humans' unlimited potential, but... He became silent. However, even if he didn't hear the rest of the story, Weong understood. After all, in the end, humanity wasn't able to stop the demons. Instead, due to conflicts between humans, numerous humans with potentials were killed. And, even Merlin, himself, wasn't able to consider humans' desires and their selfishness. No, even if he knew, like a Pandora's box, he might have still firmly believed in them as their last hope. However, if it is you, the person who was chosen by the Masters of the Darkness, I believe you have the potential of becoming a true hero. The burning look of Merlin's eyes were making him feel uncomfortable. However, Weong didn't really like how he was sweet-talking him. Weong placed a lot of pressure on his neck before he spoke. So what is your point? Become my successor. Weong thought he had heard of this somewhere. That a person could potentially receive a class from supreme beings. Unlike other people, Weong was able to accept 4 classes. As of now, since he has earned a secret class, it wasn't a bad idea to earn another. Still, Death Lord is one of the magic-type classes. Weong was planning on getting specifically distinct classes. And just by the name, he could tell that the Court Magician class was one of the magic-type classes. I refuse. You, refuse. In an instant, Merlin's expression became strange. It was an expression like he never expected to get refused by his offer. Weong calmly spoke. To become your successor means that I need to be here for a long time, right? Merlin was a being unable to leave this blue temple. To learn from him meant that a lot of time will be spent here. 10 years would be more than enough. You will be an accomplished magician. Weong just shook his head from the expected answer. Becoming an accomplished magician seemed nice, but in 10 years, he could gain a lot more by living in the underworld. He needed to be the first to retrieve specific treasures. I'm more curious about the world beyond these gates. Even if you go there aren't many good things to see. It's much better to learn from me now and go against the demons later. If I become your successor, does that mean I can kill the demons for sure? That. Of course, it would be impossible. Like he said, all Weong could do was fight against them. Weong knew the end of Merlin. Even when he returned to his former self, all he could do was tie up 3 top-ranking demons for 10 days. That was all. Even if Weong was to take all Merlin had to offer, it meant that there was a limit. Of course, just that by itself was an incredible thing. It was enough for him to be called the Supreme Magician. However, Weong knew too much about the past. It would be foolish for him to waste 10 years here. Therefore, he calmly replied. As humans are faced with trials, by overcoming them, they get stronger. And a system that rewards you appropriately is exceptionally pleasing. Since you will be rewarded for the amount of effort you put in. Selfishness of the humans have gone too far. If you pass the gates, monsters and demons aren't the ones to be worried about, it's facing the sickening desires of humans, the same kind as you. Are you going to consider that as a trial too? If they stop me, I will destroy them. I'm not willing to leave anything that stands in my way. Ha! As Merlin listened to Weong's answers, he sighed. It was because he knew that whatever he had to say, wouldn't go through to Weong. Weong's determination was that firm. What a shame, what a real shame. Why don't you look for a successor yourself instead of just waiting? There are plenty of people who are more talented than me. It wasn't like Weong was exceptionally talented in magic. However, considering how many real genius magicians have shown up in the underworld, it wasn't like Merlin couldn't find a successor. But, Merlin didn't move from the center of the forest. Even if a genius showed up, how can he find a successor if he just sits and waits? I'm not just looking at skills. But you do make a good point. Merlin sighed out loud. I've basically given up on relying on humans. Just enjoyed wagering with a few humans who came to see me. However, after seeing you, I wanted to try once more. You will surely find someone. Finally, Merlin took out a small bottle from his side. Take it. It's the secret medicine of the sage. Inside the bottle, there was a liquid that had a red glow. The secret medicine of the sage. It was an item recognized as the pinnacle of alchemy. It was one of the choices he had when he made it to Solomon's Hall of Fame for killing the boss. But unfortunately, it was a reward he had to give up. However, Muyong gave him a flat refusal. I'm not interested in becoming your successor. Even then, Merlin didn't take his hand back. I'm not giving it to you because of that. My primary role is to make heroes and to guide them. Since I can see hope in you, I can't just send you away, can I? For a long time, Merlin just looked at Muyong without saying a word. Muyong didn't try look away either. If Merlin was willing to give him the secret medicine of the sage with no strings attached, there was no reason for him to refuse. As Muyong grabbed the bottle, Merlin spoke as if he was worried. I hope your will won't be broken. Nothing will be able to break my will. Muyong waited 40 years to get this chance. A chance to go through his life again. Never, no matter what happens, Muyong wasn't willing to waste this chance. Chapter 18, Art of Death, End. Merlin placed a spell on the hunting map Muyong had. It evolved to be an item that allowed him to move without getting lost, at least in Blue Temple. Afterwards, Muyong headed out on his own. Although he could feel the lingering gaze of Merlin, he knew that if they were to stay together, they would only grow to become more attached to each other. On his way back, Muyong killed monsters and used his Art of Death skill to increase his level of understanding. Level 14. Type Zombie. Strength 17, Agility 15, Stamina 20, Intelligence 3, Wisdom 1. Cure. Grrrrrr. The completed undead looked at Muyong while flicking its tongue. After wildly mixing the corpses of a monkey monster and a red salamander, he received an art score of 5. Just mixing them won't do. Muyong lived the past 40 years as an assassin. Perhaps the little artistic sense he may have had in the past had already disappeared by now. He rubbed his chin. How to get a higher score? However, the stronger a class was, the more difficult it was to master. If he carefully experimented, he would be able to laugh at the face of necromancers. I should make a skeleton by carving out the bones. Instead of connecting monsters' body parts to create a zombie, wouldn't it be better to create a skeleton by carving out its bones? Muyong first looked for materials. If the materials were good, it would have a better compensation effect. And it was making a soldier out of bones. He couldn't just use the random bones of monsters. He needed the sturdiest bones possible. If I remember correctly, there were cannibalistic elephants around here. He thought of the elephants that lived in the forest of the Blue Temple. These elephants that had robust frames and huge ivory tusks were very hard to find as there were only a few. Cases of them being found were very rare. Even in the case that they were found, it was difficult for someone to fight them alone. However, Muyong had the map Merlin had placed a spell on. Also, Muyong wasn't just an ordinary person. In the underworld, he might have been a weakling, but at Blue Temple, he was one of the strongest. Muyong quickly moved his steps and entered the territory of the cannibalistic elephants. He was able to witness 4 elephants drinking water near a lake. Unlike regular elephants, cannibalistic elephants did not normally move in groups. At most, they moved as a family. But, they were aggressive and were known to enjoy fights. If you approached them carelessly, you might suddenly get attacked by them. Muyong carefully stalked the elephant family, and at the moment an elephant was by itself, he rushed in. Tralala! The elephant who discovered Muyong screamed out loud. It was because Muyong swiftly went on top of the elephant to stab its neck with anguish. The elephant constantly shook its body, but it was useless as Muyong was stuck to him like a glue. Thump! As soon as anguish had sucked out all of its blood, the elephant collapsed onto the ground. Muyong wiped his forehead. I think I also need the cartilages and the tendons. He couldn't make a skeleton with just its ivory tusks. He needed enough cartilage and tendons to connect the bones to make a proper shape. However, Muyong didn't have enough time to dissect the enormous elephant by parts, as the other elephants may discover and attack him. Remove the skin. Scrape. Growl. Muyong wasn't alone. The giant undead serpent and the undead salamander monkey followed Muyong's order and started to move slowly. The serpent swallowed a big chunk and spat it out, while the monkey used his dull sword to slice the skin off. They were slow, but it was much faster than Muyong doing it alone. Muyong started to dissect the elephant and left the useful parts aside. When he had gathered enough bones to create a skeleton, he finished by cutting off its ivory tusks. He wasn't done just because he had collected enough materials. A lot of knowledge and effort was required in slicing the tusks to make a skeleton. It was fortunate that he knew the anatomy of a human body better than anyone else, but it was hard work to carve the tusks into bones. Scrape. Scrape. After moving to a safe area, Muyong started to cut the tusks inside an empty cave. If he had a sharp chisel, it would have made the job much easier, but all he had was axe to carefully carve the tusks. The axe was one of the items he grabbed while he was massacring the monsters with Merlin protecting him. It seemed like a waste to throw it out, but as he didn't really need it, he kept it in his infinity pouch. Carving wasn't hard to do. All he had to do was concentrate his strength and scratch along the grain. This is an interesting experience. He chuckled out loud. Something he had never done. It wasn't a bad feeling. It must be because you get stronger by learning things you didn't know and by overcoming them. It wasn't bad for Muyong to experience these things. It's probably better to make it a bit different than just having it shaped like a normal human. Didn't he just have to make it as beautiful as he could? To Muyong, art was beauty. He thought that his concept wasn't bad. Scrape. Scrape. Muyong's hands slowly moved faster. As he started to shape the bones and pieced together the pieces, more than half of a day had passed. Muyong nodded as he was satisfied with his finished work. A skeleton with small wings was laid out on the ground. As Muyong activated Art of Death, a dark aura emitted from Muyong's hand and wrapped around the skeleton. Type: Skeleton. Level: 21. Strength 33, Agility 19, Stamina 23, Intelligence 5, Wisdom 4. Rattle. Rattle. Skeleton stood up awkwardly. As Muyong looked at the skeleton, he found out that the bilateral symmetry was slightly off. It was the first time he had made anything. He couldn't be satisfied on his first try. As if handicapped, the skeleton walked while dragging its right foot. A score of 15. It couldn't be considered as a high score, but compared to the serpent or the monkey, it was much better. Its stats were also quite decent. Maybe it was because he made it with the tusks of the elephant, but its strength was high. This should be similar to a typical undead. Take this. It was the axe I used to make you. Muyong handed the axe he used to carve the tusks. Since the skeleton had a high level of strength, it was perfect for it. Crack. It made weird noises as it reached out to grab the axe. The temple was calm. The survivors, including Tiwan, gulped down their saliva as they blocked the entrance of the temple. 20 days had passed since they had first arrived. He had heard from Muyong that there would be a boss battle every 10 days. If that was true, then today was the day a strong boss would make an appearance. Tiwan looked around. 15 survivors. Almost no one had died since the 10th day. It was due to T1's leadership and his shield. However, today, T1 was nervous. Thump. Thump. Soon after, a huge monster appeared heading towards the entrance as the ground shook. A goblin. Everyone was puzzled after seeing it. It was 2.5 m tall, one-eyed monster, with a small horn on its forehead, holding a large bat. Whoever looked at it was reminded of a goblin. It seemed to be a female considering her large breasts. It was the first time they faced a human-like monster. Gah-ah-ah-ah-ah. The goblin ran towards them while screaming out loud. Let's act calmly. As usual, just attack behind me. The very first to act was T1, with his shield of eradication. The only reason why there weren't many casualties was because T1 stood and blocked the front. But, the conditions weren't great this time. The shield of eradication's toughness buff worked when there were numerous of enemies. But, there was only one golem. Thump. Quack. It was only a single attack. But, it felt like his arm was being shattered. T1 clenched his teeth. As if it was unexpected, the goblin tilted her head. At that moment, a rain of arrows flew towards her. However, a fog-like shield was formed beside the goblin and all the arrows bounced off. Ah! As expected, the boss is different. It was on a different level than normal monsters. Even against Releka, it was Onhu who killed the boss himself. Thump. 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 T1 was at his limit after blocking a few more of the goblin's attacks. Crack. He wasn't able to handle her attack any longer and his bones snapped. Damn it! He felt like he was going to faint. Holding his right arm, he dropped onto the ground. The goblin slowly approached him. If only Hyungnim was here. Although he had made a resolution to protect the others by himself, there was a limit to his abilities. Soon, the goblin tried to smash T1's head off with her bat. T1 closed his eyes. Swaak. He only heard a noise, his head wasn't split open. T1 opened his eyes and saw an odd sight. A serpent. A huge serpent was wrapped around the goblin. Gwaa! Gwaa! The enraged goblin held the serpent by its neck. She then threw the serpent on the ground and started to rip its body apart with her bare hands. Swing! Thump! At that moment, a dagger flew straight towards the goblin's head and embedded itself into the back of her head. As if the barrier didn't work properly, the goblin's body started to wobble. And then he appeared. Twak! Lowering his body as low as possible, he ran at an incredible speed, then flew up and sliced the neck of the goblin. Hyungnim. Goblins can't produce a barrier if they can't see where an attack is coming from. Aim for her back or her neck. Your back. T1 leaned forward and attempted to get up to greet him, but Onhu stopped him. This isn't the end. A male is going to show up soon. The moment Onhu finished his words, an enraged cry sounded out. The ground shook from just the sound. As they turned their heads, a completely red goblin snorted violently as he was staring deathly at them. Chapter 19, Blood Red Tower, 1. TL by Mayanai. Edited by Mayanai and Yoni. Goblin. This goblin was different from the virtuous goblins that appeared in folk tales. There were a variety of goblins in the underworld, however all of them were strong, yet savage and cruel. The reddening of the skin when angry is the special trait of blaze goblins. Among goblins, blaze goblins were known for their foul temper. It seemed like the previously killed goblin was his mate. The goblin was angrier than he had ever been before. The goblin brandished its giant club. Soon a black fog formed above the goblin. Blaze. A flame created from the fog flew in the direction of Onhu. Since he was aware of what kind of attack he was going to make, it wasn't hard avoiding it. However, he wasn't finished with just one attack. Blaze. Blaze. In a moment, his surroundings became a sea of flames. Back off! Muyong grasped anguish. The flames of a blaze goblin weren't the kind that could be easily put out. Until the anger of the blaze goblin died down, the flames would endlessly burn everything in its surroundings. I will help you. Muyong glanced at Tiwan's current condition. The hand holding his shield was broken and his muscles were very distorted. If he pushed himself too hard in his current condition, his arm would have to be amputated. Slam! Muyong kicked Tiwan's body. Get lost! You aren't of any help. This was the truth. By needlessly pushing himself, he could end up being a hindrance in Muyong's battle. Also, it was better to face the blaze goblin by himself than with a group. Slash! Muyong forcefully cut the neck of the dead female goblin with the dagger embedded in her head. He then held the female goblin's head in his hands. Do you want her? Gra! Gra! As his mate's corpse was desecrated, the blaze goblin's red skin incomparably reddened. Excluding the Goblin King, all goblins had lifelong mates. They were devoted to each other and spent their lives together. If their mate died, they didn't look for another. They had a very loyal side to them. His enemy was bad. Then take her. Muyong threw the head of the female goblin high above his head. When the blaze goblin moved to catch his mate's head, Muyong threw the dagger, predicting where the head would land, and quickly rushed out. Others may look at this and curse and point their fingers, however Muyong held the opinion of doing whatever it takes to win. Someone who was only kind will die. Only because Muyong knew to use any weakness, he was able to survive as the greatest assassin. Even if you were to say his end wasn't great. The blaze goblin caught the falling head of his mate, however a dagger stabbed into his back. He purposely took the hit. If he did not step in the way, his mate's head would have been pierced. The place where the head would fall and the direction of which the dagger flew completely intersected. Only if he was to sacrifice his back was he able to protect what he wanted to protect. As expected. Up until this point, it was as he planned in his head. Blazed sea. Soon the whole body of the blaze goblin was burning. After carefully placing the female's head on the ground, the blaze goblin grinned his teeth and charged towards Muyong. Clash! Anguish bounced off. Immense monstrous power. However, as soon as Anguish had bounced off, he twisted his body and arrived at the blaze goblin's chest. Flames completely engulfed Muyong. The goblin won't be able to guard his blind spots. As he wasn't able to follow Muyong's instantaneous movements, the blaze goblin was unable to set up a guard. Using this opening, Anguish was wrenched into the blaze goblin's body. Crash! The problem was the flames. Even if it was Muyong, if he was to receive these flames unconditionally, there was no way he was going to survive. The only reason he was able to last this long was due to the enhancement of a stat after taking the secret medicine of the sage. Magic resistance. The secret medicine of the sage was a liquid medication that would randomly raise one of his stats. Since it was random, it heavily relied on luck. However, Muyong knew of a method to reduce the options. The secret medicine of the sage's random stat would slightly differ depending on the time and place. Luckily, it was a full moon yesterday. The night of a full moon was the most abundant in magic power. There was an especially large amount of magic power reflected off the lakes. This was how Muyong was able to enhance his magic resistance. Magic resistance. Just like its name, it was able to raise the resistance against magic and special skills. It was rare for common equipment to have a magic resistance stat. Even related skills were rare and only cleric and support classes were able to raise magic resistance a little for a limited time. However, it was different if the basic magic resistance stat was increased. Depending on one's effort, it was possible to permanently raise the magic resistance stat. Being one of the strongest depended on if they used the secret medicine of the sage to raise their magic resistance. Was there anything more to say? The problem was it was incredibly hard to obtain the secret medicine of the sage. As Muyong was satisfied with 4 classes, he chose the talisman of Azura, otherwise he would have chosen the secret medicine of the sage. However, he was able to obtain the secret medicine of the sage through Merlin. It's a battle of who endures the longest. The dagger was laced with a strong neurotoxin. Even the blaze goblin would be affected by it. On top of that, anguish was ceaselessly draining his blood. He tried to get Muyang off in any way possible, but Muyang was also desperately holding on. If it was only a battle of endurance, it was more advantageous for Muyang. As soon as the blaze goblin's strength weakened, anguish cut through his chest in a vertical line and pierced his throat. Slam! The blaze goblin fell to his knees. Muyang drew anguish and sheathed it. In the first boss battle, Muyang had approximate level of contribution of 80%. As their group was smaller, it was much easier to monopolize the level of contribution. It was because he became incomparably stronger than himself 10 days ago. Just like before, Muyang shook his head to decline. Alexandro was already the guild master of one of the 9 great guilds, the Sun Guild. Lucien was someone who was first in Solomon's Hall of Fame in number of humans killed when Muyang started to assassinate people. Fighting King Lucien. At first he wasn't too sure, but after looking at the boss battle rankings, he was certain. Although he didn't place within the top 10 among humans, he was a monster who came close. His title, Fighting King, showed that he was a fighting psycho with strength second to none, never leaving an enemy, a complete wild man. The two of them both had high levels of contribution, however there was around 10% difference from Muyang. There was no choice as he was forcefully given a skill. As much as there was no choice, it was bound to be a useful reward. Muyang expectantly checked the skill. Skill name, Talisman Creation, rank, nothing. Info: transform something that contains an object, creature, magic, or holy power into a talisman. Only items the user possesses are able to be used. It was a skill that created talismans. Seeing how it wasn't ranked, it seemed like it could only hold one effect. Not bad. Depending on how the skill was used, it was better than most high-ranking items. Its usability was a bit broader than the Infinity Pouch. In the very least, Infinity Pouch had a size constraint and could not hold living creatures. However, Talisman Creation could accommodate a larger variety. Something containing magic or holy power, I guess these mean skills. This was the part that received most of his attention. If it was possible, it meant that he was able to convert the priest's blessing into a single-use talisman and use it during hunts. Also it would be useful for hiding things. Simply put, its uses were limitless. Muyang lowered his head and gazed at the blaze goblin. The hand of the blaze goblin fell in the direction of the female goblin. He could feel his will to be together even in death. I'll do as you wish. A blaze goblin was the best material he could use currently. Muyang dragged the two corpses in attempt to create an undead. Muyang built a simple log cabin near the temple and locked himself inside. There was no one who would bother him now. In fact, there were quite a few that were happy with Muyang's return. In this place, there was no one who could hunt the boss by themselves. No, even facing the monster raid every day was too much. However, Muyang would be able to take care of these by himself. If for a while, they struggled to live, with Muyang, they were able to be more relaxed. There were even a lot of people leaving food in front of Muyang's cabin. Going beyond leaning against Muyang, there were some who started to revere his power. Also, there was a rumor Muyang was able to handle death. This rumor started from the skeleton and zombie guarding his cabin. The mixture of fear and awe made some even deify Muyang. Muyang Nim 1. I killed the wicked woman who slandered Muyang Nim. Late at night. As soon as Muyang stepped out of his cabin, a man kneeled and handed him a package wrapped in cloth. A familiar face of a woman was inside the cloth. Kim Soyoung. At one time, she tried to seduce Muyang and failed. Next, she stuck next to Oh Young, who died by Muyang's hands, a woman who walked a stray path. Although he never paid attention to her, it seemed like she was slandering Muyong when she was alive. It seemed as though she thought that making Muyong the bad guy was the only way for her to survive. And then she died from a man who followed Muyong as if he was a god. Soyoung's eyes were wide open. How cruel was her death that her face still held a pained expression. Muyong frowned. A human killing another human wasn't something weird at this point, however someone killing another for his sake felt different. Even more, he didn't feel happy about this kind of attention. Clear it away. Does it not satisfy you? Please do not leave us. The man slammed his head on the ground. His figure showed that he completely believed that without Muyong at the temple, they would all die. This wasn't what I hoped for. Following something blindly would eventually lead to only being able to see things in black and white. And seeing things only in black and white was the greatest deterrent in unifying humanity. While humanity was on the brink of destruction, the forest of death's clients may or may not have increased, but they definitely did not decrease. He acted so he didn't have to see that ever again, but to think out that because of him, these same events were happening, made him feel terrible. If you don't leave within 3 seconds, I'll cut your head off. Yeah. Yes. The man held the cloth and ran away. Tiwan will punish him in the morning. Tiwan was trying to maintain rules and protect others in his own way. Muyong clicked his tongue as he looked up at the night sky. An awfully large amount of stars was shooting down. 10 days from now. This was the time left until the gates would open and teleport them into the underworld. And before that time, there was something he had to get. After 5 days, I will climb the tower. On the 25th day, towers will automatically emerge at the centers of all the temples. The tower only allowed those who have killed humans to enter. And once they entered, until they completed a special objective, no one was allowed to leave. I have to obtain the lunatic sovereign's ring from there. The tower was connected to every temple. The surviving elite would gather there. And only by massacring approximately 200 people who enter would he be able to obtain the lunatic sovereign's ring. Although it was the most savage condition, he had to obtain the ring. The greatest possible treasure earned from the Blue Temple was that ring. Also, the lunatic sovereign's ring was one of the items essential to awakening the S-rank weapon, Diabolos. A weapon above S-rank was almost non-existent in the underworld. No more than an amount you could count with your hand. So, he had to once again become a slaughter to accomplish his goals. Only those who have killed humans were allowed inside the tower. It was the start of a blood-red festival for murderers. Muyong's eyes sunk endlessly. One nim to indicate reverence, high standing, or in this case, God. Chapter 20, Blood Red Tower, 2. TL by Mayanai. Edited by Mayanai and Yoni. He sat with his legs crossed and meditated. Silently re-evaluating himself, Muyong would always meditate like this when he wanted to contemplate on his life and the mistakes he had made. And this time, he closed his eyes to plan something. He was conceptualizing the figure and the use of the undead he would create from the corpses of the goblin couple. To Muyong, this sort of effort itself was new to him. The pondering Muyong opened his eyes. The goblins looked too pitiful. Susie, who was silently playing with the Emperor of Shrew Mice, King, said directly. The only one who would walk into Muyong's home with no hesitation was Susie. The Susie, who was stricken with fear, watching Muyong cut off Zhuyang's head, seemed like she had changed, as she would come whenever she wanted to play with King. Muyong didn't refuse her. However, it was rare for one to let another enter their personal space. Muyong, himself, thought it was strange and came to one conclusion. It must be a specific trait of the Valkyrie of Dawn. Susie would receive some care from everyone at the temple. If it was like before, this would have been unimaginable. Everyone would have chosen to ignore the young Susie for their own survival. Perhaps, the Valkyrie of Dawn had an effect that would make surrounding humans more friendly to one another. Its effect was similar to the one the Saintess, Snow, had in the past. The goblins are pitiful. As long as she wasn't hostile, there was no reason for Myung to chase her out. If she was a disturbance, it may be different, but whenever he was doing something, Suzy would even go as far as slowing her breathing to stay silent. After asking her again, Suzy answered. The couple wanted to stay together. She pointed to the corpses of the couple. The Blaze Goblin definitely wanted to be with the head of the female goblin until the very dead. Aren't they together? Not that. A bit more closer, It seemed like she was having a hard time thinking of the right words. However, he understood the gist of her intention. Myung motionlessly stared at the two goblins. There are trees that fuse to form a single tree as their branches tangle together. People called this phenomenon, inosculation. Fuse them together. Combining the structures of similar goblins didn't seem like it would result in a more special undead. However, instead of replacing certain parts of the body, if he was to connect them, would it yield a better result? He had to make it so that the two bodies moved like one. He thought that this was a challenge worth challenging. The exposed skeletons of the goblins had their backs facing each other. After burrowing grooves in their spines, he interlinked them like a jigsaw. If, by any chance, two individuals were combined into this form, they wouldn't even be able to walk properly. Only after they knew each other's tempo and were considerate enough, would they be able to move. However, these two were a couple. Even in death, the Blaze Goblin didn't hesitate to throw his body to protect the corpse of his mate. Although goblins were aggressive and cruel, their loyalty towards their mate was better than humans. Until they died, they would only care for a single goblin. I'll do as you wish. Although it was a simple job, he was satisfied. According to the Blaze Goblin's wishes, Myung placed them as close together as possible. The head of the female was embedded in her chest. Soon after, Myung raised his hands and casted the Art of Death skill. Finally, a short scene played in Myung's head. The story of the two goblins unfolded like a movie. A battlefield. Hundreds of Blaze Goblins and the ice-attributed Frost Goblins were gruesomely fighting against each other. The two met each other as enemies. Eventually, the Blaze Goblins lost and everyone died. However, for some reason, the female goblin hid the dying male. She cared for him devotedly for a long time. The male was touched by her sincerity and proposed to her. Even facing opposition from their tribes, they promised to care for each other for their whole lives. However, they could only run and escape from pursuit of their tribes. Perhaps it was inevitable that they ended up at the Blue Temple. Although they did die by Myung's hands, they were at peace. Their love for each other would continue on in death. Level 47. Type Skeleton. Strength 45, Agility 36, Stamina 51, Intelligence 21, Wisdom 34. Plus can cast a mantle of fire and ice in a radius of 5 m. Plus can use the skills, Flame Cannon, and Ice Pillar. Plus very slow. Myung read and reread the words for a long time. This work was incomparable to the previous works he had made. Kriaak. Soon, the moving skeleton of fire and ice began to undergo a transformation. The empty sockets of the Blaze Goblin were filled with flames while frost began to settle on the whole body of the Ice Goblin. Hey! Honestly, Myung's thoughts on the undead were simple. Quality over quantity. Anyone would be pressured from the increasing amount of undead during war. However, the undead in front of his eyes was enough to smash Myung's understanding. Using only an F-rank skill and some decent materials, he was able to create something beyond his imagination. The story is important. Unlike the other undead, there was a story to the two goblins. That story was reflected in the art score. The combinations of undead he had seen in his dream seemed to have been a trap. If I get a high score, does my skill rank up? It seemed that no matter how many of those undead he makes, it wouldn't be very effective. He thought it was hard, but now he realized he was thinking inside the box. Undead were monsters that shined depending on the death of the living. Obviously, the focus should be placed on the stories of when they were living. It looks like it will be of some help. Muyeong looked at the skeleton of fire and ice and nodded in satisfaction. Its stats weren't very different from his own. He felt that it could be of vital importance in the tower. Although its flaw was that it was slow, it wasn't a big concern, as he could just make it into a talisman and use it when he needed it. Talisman creation. Muyeong placed his hand on the skeleton of fire and ice and activated the skill. The skeleton of fire and ice quickly shrunk and soon became a single talisman. Now, whenever he wanted, he could summon the skeleton of fire and ice with this talisman. Soon, the 25th day, since they arrived, had arrived. And at the same time the sun was rising, the ground shook as a giant tower emerged. The tower was odd. Its red sheen made one image blood and an unknown moan sounded out. A sign made of rock was erected at the entrance of the tower. Only those who have murdered may enter. You are unable to leave unless you survive for 5 days or kill 5 people. A reward will be handed out depending on the number of people you have killed. They were simple rules. Unless one was obsessed with murder, they would not enter. In reality, everyone was just staring at the tower. Only Muyeong was entering that place. If you don't want to die, don't come. This was the only warning Muyeong could give. Muyeong completely erased his expressionless expression. Abyss-like eyes and the murderous intent hidden within. He was the one who killed countless people for 40 years. Although he resolved to live a different life, the past wasn't something that could fade. The blood of the forest of death still flowed in him. Cold and heartless. He was a monster who would kill others without a moment's hesitation. What's more, as his targets were all murderers, and those that willingly entered the tower to kill, there was nothing to hide. The tower was like a first-round interview venue. They would meet after transferring into the underworld. If it was like any other day, Muyeong would have worn a mask to hide his identity. However, Muyeong simply unsheathed anguish and walked forward. There was no need for a mask if he killed everyone he saw.